Okay, this video is in the continuity of the previous two videos, namely I try to show the formal presentation of the process of becoming conscious of itself, that which we call God, and I try to fill in the formal structure of the Encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences, which presents this process with the categories that are used in today's world, in the 21st century, in order to make the formal aspect intelligible, so to speak, in order to see how or where every branch of the sciences fits into the totality, becoming conscious of itself. So this is a document that will have to be used eventually by others, which are parts of the process and parts of myself, since we are all moments of this process. And I know myself to be what Hegel calls the negative, so to speak. So that's why I have a vision of the totality. And eventually, this is this is becoming conscious of itself. This is what we are as different modes of the same totality, to speak like Spinoza, whatever. So here, this is the Zweite Teil. My previous video was the Dritte Teil, but here I go back to the Zweite Teil, namely the philosophy of nature. And this is how a cognitive, a conceptual understanding of nature unfolds itself, so to speak. So I will show the various paragraphs. Introduction, here I do not need to comment. So I've tried to make this intelligible, at least for people who have a scientific background, which on an empirical level I do not possess, but people who are students in high school or in colleges, or in the long term, those who will watch this video for the scientists themselves, and people will be free to improve this, because I know that I will not have the possibility of improving in this sense, because I have realized that I have done my part of the job. Maybe it was a mistake, but at least I know that I will no longer use my time to improve this classification. I have other things to do, but yeah. So for instance, in the Erste Abteilung, die Mechanik, which contains, in the language of the writings of Hegel, Raum und Zeit, so space and time, this we could include, if we had to classify modernity, relativity and geometry. So all the physicists and the mathematician who study either relativity or geometry, all their works, their consciousness, their state of mind could be included within all their work within the process of nature becoming conscious of itself through the thinking activity of scientists. And then in these parts, der Ort und die Bewegung, and the second part, Materie und Bewegung, endliche Mechanik, I talked about this in the video just before this one that you can watch. We could here include quantum physics, mechanics, nuclear physics, classical mechanics. And in the part of absolute mechanic, we could include cosmology, astronomy, astrophysics, and a broad view of physics at large, the most general branches of physics. So I will just show again, if we had to classify, this is what I have thought. Maybe I'm deluding myself, and experts, if they watch this video somehow someday, might disagree, but that's how I understand this with the categories of modernity, so to speak, that relativity, geometry is not a branch of the physical sciences, but here the mathematical aspect of space, the geometrical aspect of space is included here. So relativity, geometry, quantum physics, mechanics, nuclear physics, classical mechanics, cosmology, astronomy, astrophysics, and physics at large in its broadest aspect. This is what could be classified in the Erste Abteilung Mechanik. Now, in die zweite Abteilung der Naturphilosophie comes die Physik, and here are the categories that I showed in the previous video, and here are some of the classification that I've made, because I've spent a lot of time to work on this over the past few months, because I was trying to understand and to make things intelligible. It's only very recently that I understood that the reason why my videos have almost no success is not because it was not rigorous enough, and it's not because of a lack of formal presentation, although it's partly true, and I have improved the formal aspect of my video through a screen recording, but it's simply because actually it's way too complex. So, but I try nonetheless to remain at a certain intellectual standard, but I do not know all the determinations of here of photochemistry, electromagnetism, or optics. I simply explain that in order to understand what nature is, and since man is nature thinking itself, that comes from Schelling and from footnotes to Plato, that we are nature philosophizing from this perspective. If we want to understand ourselves, we have to understand nature and how nature is divided. So here in the second Abteilung, the second section, die Physik, we find physics and chemistry. So if that's my own view, and it can be corrected because I'm not sure, but in this subdivision, das Licht, which is light, there would be photochemistry, electromagnetism, and optics. Then the bodies of des Gegensatzes, the opposition in a way, the body of the individuality, here we would find partly astronomy, and that's why, here I make a small comment, a brief comment, that's why the philosophy of nature by Hegel is not taken seriously by any modern scientist, because it's unintelligible, but it has to be made intelligible. Why do we find electromagnetism and then partly astronomy? It's not very clear, because he talks about the life of the solar system as a living totality. So yeah, it's complex, but I just by implementing the proper categories of the proper branches of the sciences, it helps make the writings a lot more intelligible. Then the elements, we find the subdivisions, air, the Luft, the elements of the opposition again, and here we could use thermochemistry and thermodynamics, and these are branches of the sciences that students who go to college and who study physics, they study. And this has a place within the Encyclopedia, but in order to reach the truth, which eventually is spiritual, one has to understand, at least in their broad aspect, all the branches, all the moments, in a way. If we just study thermodynamics without studying the rest of physics and the rest of biology, etc., the rest of anthropology and psychology, etc., one doesn't understand anything of the totalities. We only have one aspect, so to speak. Then in individualist element, here we will find a mixture of chemistry and physics, chemical physics, geochemistry, geology, and soil science. And in der elementarische Prozess, because it is the process of the totality, there is ecology in a sense, planetary geology, so the geological determination of the planets and the planet Earth, meteorology, climatology, and all this has, in case it's not clear, has an influence upon human beings, the way they think, the way they interact, the way they anticipate, the way they behave, the way society organizes, on the historical process. So without taking into account all the moments of the Encyclopedia, which I have tried to make intelligible, reality is simply unintelligible. So that's all I'm saying. Environmental science, environment, soil science, environmental geology, seismology, volcanology. So in order to understand the Earth, but also human societies, in order to understand a society like Japan, or like a state like California, or where there's a strong seismic activity historically, it has an impact upon the educational system, upon the security system, upon the mentality of the people, upon the way the architects build their buildings, the way the economy functions. So in order to understand anything at all, one might say, one has to understand the various determinations. Yeah. Then, in the second part, die Physik, we have Physik der besonderen Individualität. Here, what the writings of Hegel talk about, because I have spent a lot of time reading, I mean, maybe not enough, because I read the logic more than nature or Geist, but what I have understood with my limited knowledge of the various sciences, here in the spezifische Schwere, so in these paragraphs, one could classify physical chemistry, quantum chemistry, nuclear chemistry, condensed matter physics. Then we have cohesion, der Klang und die Wärme. So in these two subsections, sound and heat, we could classify sonochemistry, acoustics, thermodynamics, again, and chemical thermodynamics. And the part Physik der totalen Individualität, here we find biophysical chemistry, biochemistry, electromagnetism, electrochemistry, radiochemistry, and photochemistry. And these are branches of the sciences that physicists throughout the world are dedicated time and effort to try to understand. And that's why also Hegel, or the writings of Hegel, are not taken seriously, because one has to actualize, in a sense, not being made wirklich, but to up to date, not wirklich, but up to date. Like it's to update, not actual, but update, or improve, or make modern in a way. And yeah, that's why the Encyclopedia is a self-actualizing, self-correcting, self-thinking, self-adapting, self-modifying, self-improving process in a way. Then in Die Gestalt, which is a part of Physik der totalen Individualität, we would find geophysics, planetary geology, magnetism, and electrochemistry, because it's a totality. One has to think about the totality. So here are the determinations found in Die Gestalt, geophysics, etc., etc. Here die Besonderung des individuellen Körpers, Verhältnis zum Licht, so relationship to light. Yeah. And here in the totality, in the particular individuality, electricity, we find alchemy, optics, electromagnetism, neurochemistry, flavor chemistry, and unology, which is it's not really a science, but it's the doctrine of the theory. It's not a doctrine, it's I don't know how you call this in English, know-how, which concerns the study of wine and the appreciation of wine, and electricity and chemistry. So that's what is to be found. And also the reason why the writings of Hegel have been unintelligible to almost everyone is because he mixes alchemy with modern determination of the sciences. So yeah, that's quite unintelligible sometimes. Finally, in Der chemische Prozess, we have organic chemistry with the subdivision, galvanismus, the process of fire, the process of water, and the process in its totality. And here we find electricity, chemistry, alchemy. Here we have bioorganic chemistry, biochemistry, biophysics. So just to make things clear, but from an intellectual standpoint, the philosophy of Hegel is indeed very demanding, because one has to understand not everything in all the details, but to understand that every physical object is determined by the totality of all the determinations. That it's very demanding, but I've reached a point where I said to myself, it's way too difficult. But actually, that's why maybe there's not just one human being on an empirical level. There are many, because to think all alone about these topics. I mean, I don't do it all alone because I borrow and even I steal in a way the works of Hegel and the works of modern scientists, but to try to think about the totality alone, it's quite difficult, but maybe it's rewarding from an intellectual standpoint, I don't know. And Dritte Abteilung, Organische Physik. So here, the broad determinations that I mentioned already in the video that I posted just before the previous one. This would be geology, botany, zoology, but in a more accurate, more specific detail, it would be the geologische Natur. We could find environmental chemistry, geophysics, planetary science, planetary geology, geochemistry, astronomy, as regarding the influence upon the magnetic field or the magnetic waves emitted by the sun onto the planet, etc. The influence of magnetic polarity on the life of the Earth. To simplify, chronobiology, the cosmic rhythm, aqueous, geochemistry, the terrestrial aquate interaction. Here I'm not sure that the English is correct because it's dubious, but anyway. Ocean chemistry, chemical oceanography, hydrogeology, limnology, freshwater versus marine biology, glaciology, which is the study of ice, basically of I don't know how you call this in English, blocks of ice. You get the idea. Coastal geography, etc. Soil science, geodesy, mineralogy, petrology, soil physics. But just here to illustrate it, in case it isn't clear, the struggles to obtain minerals or finite resources like gas, oil, etc., or the entire historical process, as it is told, the history of mankind has been partly shaped by a struggle to acquire resources. So here it's a Marxist perspective in a sense, but it's just more systematic and more completed. And geography, topography, the study of the topographic determinations of land, the mountains, plains, hills, in a sense rivers and etc. Biogeography, paleontology, physical anthropology. So here enters man, so to speak, so that's the transition between the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of Geist, which comes later. Meteorology, atmospheric physics. So all the questions about climate change, they are debated within these intellectual spheres, in a sense. It means that all those who talk about climate change, they talk about determinations which would be here, for instance, climatology or meteorology. Okay. Then, second part, the vegetabilische Natur. We could classify chemical biology, molecular biology, structural biology, cell biology, morphology, genetics. Someone like Dawkins, what he talks about in his books, what he has dedicated his professional life to, would be classified here. So he's a moment in the process of the totality becoming conscious of itself because he possesses knowledge about genetics that no or very few other people possess. And then there is botany with these various branches. Here there will be bacteriology, microbiology, and mycology. I talked about mushrooms and mycelia, but actually it's fungi in English. So yeah, it's part of biology. Then agrochemistry. So all the debates about the agro business, etc. They are moments of the totality of thinking itself in a way. About big pharma, all the debates around the well-being or the welfare or the negative impact of big pharma. This takes place if one wants to understand what people are talking about. This is how to classify the use of drugs, for instance, here. Okay. And finally, der tierische Organismus. Here we would find evolutionary biology, paleontology, zoology, partly astronomy because it influences the structure and behavior of animals, and physiology, And here in the Gestalt, there would be neurochemistry, neurobiology, neuroscience, biomechanics, pathology. So the vets could be classified here. Pharmacology, epidemiology, immunology, anatomy, physiology. But this is not simply the structure of being, this is also the structure of thought. Namely, it is not only, for instance, animals are, and humans are animals, thinking animals, but animals nonetheless. The animals have an anatomy and a physiology, but doctors, the medical staff, the scholars, they have an anatomy and a physiology, but they also have the knowledge of anatomy, whether human or animal. So it's the relationship between being, how things are, and how things, which eventually become human, think about themselves. So the planets do not know what they are, but human beings who are in relation with the planets know what they are as human beings and know what the planets are. So that's why human beings contain a wealth of knowledge about the nature and structure of the cosmos, basically. And here in the assimilation, we would find neurobiology, neuroscience, ethology, zoology, evolution, and again, anatomy and physiology. And the process of der Gattungsprozess, Genus und Species, das Geschlechtsverhältnis, the relationship of the sexes, die Krankheit des Individuums, the disease or illness of the individual, and der Tod des Individuums aus sich selbst, the death of the individual. Yeah, and then we could use comparative anatomy, ecology, racial anthropology. So racial anthropology belongs partly to the philosophy of nature, but also to the philosophy of Geist. So it's the transition. And finally, systematics, cladistics, and taxonomy, which are the branches of mostly zoology and the biological sciences, which help classify an order and structure and systematize the knowledge that thinking humans have about biological life, basically about the structure and organization of life. And an illustration, the question about racism or anti-racism in the modern West, it mostly depends on the classification and the taxonomy which is used. If the categories are not correct, the thoughts are not correct either. We have also here medicine, biomedical research, epidemiology, pathobiology, etc., etc., evolutionary biology, and medicine. So I'm in the process of sharing all my documents, and I start with the most formal ones, and then I will share the most personal. But up until a few weeks ago, I believe that the reason why, and I already told the story, the reason why my videos were not successful was because I was not rigorous enough. Because I talked about being, nothing, becoming, the categories, etc. But being includes all the sciences that I've just showed. So eventually, my purpose, but I'm not sure that I will be able to, but was to talk, for instance, someday about medicine or about ethology or about zoology. But I believed, now I understood that I deluded myself completely, that I was not rigorous enough. So that's why up until a few weeks ago, I still had in mind the idea that I had to classify all the sciences ever invented or discovered or having become conscious of itself, so that eventually if I talk about all the sciences that have ever existed, people will be interested in my videos. Because pure logic is being made manifest in the world, one might say. But I understood recently that I deluded myself completely, because it's not a lack of rigor and a lack of systematicity, because here it's not rigorous in a sense, it's very basic classification. It took me a great deal of time, but it's not very demanding, and I'm not even sure that it is correct. It's just to simplify the view. But I just realized that my mind as an empirical individual that I try to structure onto the mind of Hegel is way too complex, and that it's not a lack of rigor that has prevented people from watching my video. It's an excess, a complete excess of rigor that the ordinary people, it's not that they are not intelligent, it's simply that they are busy, or they have something more interesting to do than trying to think about the totality, because it's just it's exhausting. It's in my view it's rewarding, I will not lie, but it's also exhausting. And yeah, so I understood a couple of weeks ago or a few days ago that I had to completely change my method and make my thoughts a lot more accessible. But that's why I have understood it. But now I will not waste all that I've been working on. And eventually, when some people watch my videos, they will find this useful. Maybe I will be in a difficult position, or I will no longer be present in one way or another, but I will have brought contribution, at least, if it can help. At this point, you know, yeah, to understand reality, to understand being, to understand God, basically. Yeah, so, yeah, I will stop there, and I will not make the third video about logic. I will post these two videos. I will sleep a few hours, and I continue tomorrow.